I watched Mom rummage through my bedroom closet with the kind of focused determination usually reserved for Black Friday sales. She was pulling out boxes, bags, everything I owned, tossing items into piles without even looking at what they were. "This old stuff," she muttered, holding up a worn leather jacket I'd saved for years. "Why does Vera keep such trash?" Dad stood in the doorway, his arms crossed. "Just grab everything. Melissa needs the money for her gallery opening. Vera won't even notice. She never uses any of this junk anyway." My sister Melissa appeared behind him, her face arranged in that perfect expression of grateful sadness she'd perfected over the years. "Are you sure? I feel bad taking Vera's things." "Nonsense," Mom said, waving a dismissive hand. "You're doing something with your life. Vera just hoards. Besides, half this stuff looks like it came from a thrift store anyway. She won't miss it." I sat on my bed, silent, watching them box up my entire life. The comic books I'd collected, the vintage band t-shirts, the old cameras, the vinyl records, the watches my late grandfather had given me, the paintings I'd bought at flea markets, the first edition books, the jewelry boxes full of costume pieces, everything. And I said nothing, I just smiled, because they had no idea what they were taking. They had no idea what they were about to lose. In my first life, I died at 32, alone, estranged from my family, working 3 jobs to survive, living in a 1-bedroom apartment with black mold and broken heating. I'd died of complications from pneumonia that I couldn't afford to treat properly, and my body wasn't found for 10 days. But before I died, I'd learned something that would have changed everything if I'd known it earlier. Those worthless things I'd collected, they'd been worth millions. The comic books, first appearances of characters that became movie franchises. The vinyl records, rare pressings that collectors would kill for. The paintings from flea markets, original works by artists who later became famous. The costume jewelry, actual vintage pieces from renowned designers. The cameras, limited editions that appreciated exponentially. The watches, rare models that would auction for 6 figures each. I'd discovered this too late, after Melissa had convinced our parents to let her dispose of my things when I'd moved out. After they'd sold everything in an estate sale for a few $1,000s. After the buyer, a collector who knew exactly what he was getting, had turned around and made over $8 million from my collection. I'd seen the news article about it 2 years before I died, featuring the collector bragging about his estate sale find of the century. I'd recognized my grandfather's watches, my comics, my paintings and the photos, and I'd realized what my family had cost me. But that was my first life. Now I was 17 again. And this time, I knew exactly what everything was worth. This time, I had a plan. And this time, I was going to let them do exactly what they wanted, because they'd never see me coming. My rebirth had happened 6 months ago, on my 17th birthday. I'd woken up in my childhood bedroom, in my teenage body, with 32 years of memories intact. The shock had been overwhelming. I'd spent the first hour just touching my face, my arms, convinced I was hallucinating, but it was real. I was 17 again, and I remembered everything. I remembered how, in my first life, Melissa had been the golden child. Beautiful, charismatic, artistic. She'd wanted to open an art gallery, and our parents had liquidated my college fund to help her. When that wasn't enough, they'd started selling my things, first asking, then just taking when I protested. I remembered how I'd fought them, how I'd begged them to stop, how Mom had called me selfish, how Dad had said Melissa's dreams were more important than my hoarding, how Melissa had cried and said she never meant to cause problems between us. I remembered moving out at 18 with nothing but the clothes on my back, how they'd sold the rest while I was gone, how I'd worked myself to death trying to build a life from nothing, while Melissa's gallery had failed within 2 years and our parents had simply shrugged and said, "These things happen." I remember dying alone, broke, with nothing to show for my life but debt and regret. But that was before. Now, I had knowledge. I had time. And I had a plan that would leave them all destroyed. The first thing I'd done after confirming my rebirth was check the dates. It was January, 6 months before Melissa's urgent need for gallery funding. 6 months before they'd start taking my things. 6 months to prepare. I'd spent those months carefully, quietly, doing two things: documenting everything I owned and acquiring the things I'd missed in my first life. The comic books in my closet? I'd already photographed every issue, documented every detail, and then carefully replaced the truly valuable ones with expertly made counterfeits. The real first edition Amazing Fantasy Hash 15, worth over $3.6 million, safely stored in a climate-controlled facility under a false name. The paintings? I'd had an expert create perfect replicas of the three that were actually original works by then unknown artists. The real ones, paintings by artists who had become internationally famous within 5 years, were in a secure art storage facility in another state. The watches? Every single one had been replaced with convincing knockoffs. The real Patek Philippe, Rolex, and Audemars Piguet pieces my grandfather had left me were in a safe deposit box. The jewelry? The vintage Cartier, Van Cleef, and Arpels, and Tiffany pieces that Mom thought were costume had been swapped for actual costume jewelry. The real pieces were worth over $400,000. The fakes cost me $200. The vinyl records, the cameras, the first edition books, the designer clothes, everything valuable had been replaced with worthless counterfeits that looked identical to anyone who didn't know what to look for. I'd spent 6 months and nearly $15,000, money I'd made from strategic investments using my knowledge of the future, creating a bedroom full of convincing garbage. And now, I was letting my family steal it all. "Vera," Melissa said, finally addressing me directly, "you're being so quiet. Are you okay with this?" In my first life, this is when I'd broken down crying. This is when I'd screamed and fought and begged them not to take my things. And that's exactly what had made me the villain in their story, the jealous sister who couldn't support Melissa's dreams. Not this time. "Of course," I said, smiling serenely. "If it helps your gallery, Melissa, take whatever you need. They're just things." The three of them froze. This wasn't the script they remembered. "Really?" Mom asked suspiciously. "You're not going to throw a fit?" "Why would I? Melissa's gallery is important. I want to support her." I stood up, walked to my closet, and pulled out the box containing the watches. "Here, Grandpa would have wanted Melissa to have these if they can help her dream come true." Dad actually looked uncomfortable. "Vera, are you feeling all right?" "I'm feeling great, Dad. Really. I've been thinking about what matters in life, you know? And it's not stuff. It's family. If my things can help Melissa, then that's what matters." Melissa's eyes narrowed slightly. She wasn't stupid. She knew something was wrong. But she also knew she needed the money, and I was handing her an excuse to take everything guilt-free. "Thank you, little sister," she said, taking the box. "This means the world to me. I'll make sure the gallery credits you as a supporter." "That's not necessary," I said. "Just succeed. That's all I want." Over the next 2 hours, they cleared out my room. Every comic book, every record, every painting, every piece of jewelry, every camera, every collectible, everything I'd spent 6 months replacing with worthless forgeries. When they were done, and my room looked almost empty. Just my bed, my desk, and some clothes. "There," Mom said, surveying the hall with satisfaction. "This should sell for at least a few $1,000s. Enough for Melissa's deposit on the gallery space. A few $1,000s. For what they thought was worth maybe $10,000 total, but what they believed would save Melissa's dreams." They had no idea they were taking boxes of carefully crafted garbage, and they'd never find out, not until it was far too late. The history of my family's abuse hadn't started with the theft of my possessions. That was just the culmination of 17 years of systematic favoritism, neglect, and emotional cruelty. Melissa was 5 years older than me, and from the moment I was born, I was the disappointment. She was beautiful, blonde, blue-eyed, graceful. I was plain, mousy brown hair, average features, awkward. She was talented, painting, singing, dancing. I was ordinary, decent grades, no particular gifts. She was charismatic, everyone loved her. I was quiet, forgettable. Our parents made it clear from early childhood who mattered more. Melissa got the bigger room, the better clothes, the expensive art supplies. I got hand-me-downs and discount store basics. Melissa's birthday parties were events with 50 guests and hired entertainers. Mine were family dinners where everyone spent the time talking about Melissa's latest achievement. When I was 7, I'd won a regional writing competition. I'd been so proud, so excited to show my parents the trophy. They'd said, "That's nice, honey," then spent the rest of dinner discussing Melissa's upcoming art show at her middle school. When I was 9, I'd saved my allowance for 6 months to buy a camera at a garage sale. I'd loved photography, spent hours taking pictures of everything. Melissa had decided she wanted to try photography too. Dad bought her a professional-grade camera worth $2,000. Mine was forgotten. When I was 12, I'd made honor roll for the first time. Mom took Melissa out to celebrate getting cast in the school play. My report card went on the fridge without comment. Every accomplishment I had was overshadowed. Every interest I developed, Melissa would try and do better with more resources. Every moment that should have been mine became about her. But the real damage was more subtle than just favoritism. It was the way they taught me that my worth was conditional, that I only mattered if I was useful to Melissa, that my role in the family was to support her, enable her, fade into the background so her light could shine. My grandfather, Dad's father, had been the only one who saw me, really saw me. He'd given me those watches, those comics he'd collected as a young man, told me stories about the artists behind the paintings he'd helped me find at flea markets. He'd taught me to see value in unexpected places. "The world will tell you what's important," he'd said once when I was 14. "But real treasure is what you recognize when no one else does. Remember that, Vera." He died 6 months after that conversation. Heart attack, sudden. I'd been devastated. And within weeks, Melissa had been eyeing his collections that he'd left to me. "Are you really going to keep all that old junk?" she'd asked. "Grandpa would want you to be practical." In my first life, I'd kept them for 4 more years, until I was 18 and moved out, until they'd sold everything behind my back. But Grandpa's death had changed something in my relationship with my family. It had removed the only buffer I had, the only person who made me feel seen. After he died, the neglect became more blatant, the favoritism more cruel. When I was 16, I'd gotten a perfect score on my SATs. Mom's response? "That's good, honey. Melissa needs help moving her canvases this weekend." When I'd won a scholarship competition, Dad had said, "Great, that'll save us money. We can put more toward Melissa's college applications." When I'd had my first boyfriend and experienced my first heartbreak, crying in my room, no one had checked on me. Melissa had a gallery showing that night, and that was more important. By the time my first life hit, the moment I was currently reliving, Melissa's need for gallery funding, I'd been worn down, exhausted, almost believing them when they said my things were worthless, that Melissa's dreams mattered more, that I was selfish for wanting to keep things that could help her. I'd fought them, but only weakly. I'd cried, but I'd still let them take things. And when I'd moved out in anger and heartbreak, they'd taken the rest and never looked back. In that first life, I'd learned too late that Grandpa had been right, that the treasures I'd collected, that he'd helped me find, were worth millions. That if I just held on, if I just protected them, I could have had security, freedom, a future. Instead, I died with nothing. But now, in this second life, I understood something my first life hadn't taught me until it was too late. My family wasn't just neglectful or thoughtless. They were actively harmful. They were a weight dragging me down, a poison in my life. And the only way to survive was to cut them out completely, not with anger or tears or begging for recognition, but with cold, calculated strategy. Let them take what they thought they wanted. Let them think they'd won. And when the truth came out, when they realized what they'd actually lost, I'd be long gone, untouchable, free. The morning after they'd cleared out my room, I started phase 2 of my plan. I'd been homeschooling myself for the past 6 months, using my adult knowledge, preparing for early graduation and college entrance exams. Now, I took the GED test and passed with perfect scores. I took the SAT and got a 1600. I took several AP exams and aced every one. Then I applied for early admission to MIT with a full scholarship application, using essays about my investment and valuation consulting business, a legitimate company I'd quietly registered that did exactly what it claimed. I'd been using my future knowledge to offer remarkably prescient advice to a few carefully selected clients. My track record was already impressive enough to catch attention. I was accepted within weeks, with a full ride plus a research stipend. I'd start in the fall at 17 years old. I didn't tell my family about any of this. Not the GED, not the SAT scores, not MIT. As far as they knew, I was still a high school junior who'd mysteriously become okay with losing all her possessions. Instead, I focused on my real work, building an untouchable future. The money I'd made from investments had grown substantially. I'd started with $5,000 from selling some genuinely worthless items from my room, things I'd bought just to replace. Using my knowledge of the stock market, crypto movements, and startup success stories, I'd turned that into $150,000. With that capital, I'd made strategic investments that I knew would pay off enormously. I'd bought Bitcoin at $2,000. I'd invested in a small startup called Zoom before anyone had heard of it. I'd purchased stock in companies I knew would explode. I'd made calculated bets on everything from tech stocks to pharmaceutical companies to entertainment ventures. By the time they'd taken my possessions, I had over $800,000 in secured investments and assets. By the time Melissa opened her gallery with the proceeds from selling my fake collections, I'd have over $2 million, but money was only part of the plan. The real revenge was going to be in what they didn't know they'd lost. Melissa's gallery opened in July, funded by the sale of what she thought were my collections. She'd taken everything to an estate sale company who'd bought the lot for $8,000. She'd been thrilled, more than she expected for Vera's junk. The estate sale had happened quickly. The items had sold to various buyers for a total of about $12,000. Everyone thought they'd gotten good deals on interesting vintage items. None of them realized they were buying expertly crafted forgeries. None of them knew that within months they'd discover the truth, that the first edition comics were reprints, the vintage watches were knockoffs, the original paintings were copies. And when they did, when the complaints rolled in, when the estate sale company investigated, all the anger would flow toward one person, Melissa Reynolds, who'd sold them as authentic. I'd made sure of it. Every fake had enough authenticity markers to pass casual inspection. But under expert scrutiny, the kind that would happen when buyers tried to resell or insure their purchases, the forgeries would be obvious, and the paper trail would lead directly back to Melissa. But that would take months. First, I had to watch Melissa's moment of triumph. The gallery opening was pretentious and poorly planned, like most things Melissa did with Dad's money and Mom's blind faith. It was in a mediocre space in a so-so neighborhood, filled with her derivative paintings and a few pieces from local artists she'd convinced to show with her. The whole family attended, of course. Mom and Dad were glowing with pride. "This is what matters," Mom said, surveying the gallery. "Real achievement, making something of yourself. Melissa's going places." "Absolutely," Dad agreed. "This is the kind of success that makes a parent proud." I stood in the corner, smiled, and said nothing. I'd been invited out of obligation, attended out of strategy. I needed to be here, needed to be the supportive sister, needed to make sure no one suspected what was coming. "Vera!" Melissa called out, spotting me. She floated over in a ridiculous outfit that probably cost more than my monthly food budget. "Thank you so much for coming, and thank you again for letting me sell your things. None of this would have been possible without your support." "Of course," I said warmly. "I'm so happy I could help. The gallery looks amazing." She studied me for a moment, and I saw that flicker of suspicion again. She knew something was off. She knew I should be bitter, angry, resentful. My serene acceptance didn't fit the script. "You're being really cool about everything," she said carefully. "I know you loved some of those things, the watches especially." "They were just objects," I said. "Your dream is real. That's what matters." "Right." She didn't believe me, but she couldn't figure out the angle. "Well, I appreciate it, really." The gallery opening was a moderate success. Enough people came, enough polite interest was shown. Melissa sold a few pieces. The local paper did a small feature. It was the beginning of what she thought would be a brilliant career. I watched it all with a smile, thinking about the timeline. In my first life, Melissa's gallery had failed within 2 years. The location was bad, her business sense was worse, and her art wasn't good enough to overcome her lack of commercial acumen. This time, it would fail much faster. because in about 6 months, the forgery scandal would break. And when it did, Melissa's name would be destroyed in the art community. She'd be known as either a scammer or an idiot who couldn't tell real from fake. Either way, her career would be over before it began. But I wouldn't be here to see it. I'd be at MIT, building a life she couldn't touch. August arrived, and with it, my acceptance letter from MIT. I didn't hide this one. I needed my family to know I was leaving. Needed them to help me get away so they wouldn't come looking for me later. MIT? Mom said, reading the letter with obvious confusion. I didn't even know you applied to college. Early admission, I explained. Full scholarship. I start in 3 weeks. 3 weeks? Dad frowned. That's very sudden, Vera. We should have discussed this as a family. There's nothing to discuss. It's a full ride. It costs you nothing. I'll be out of your hair. Out of our hair? Mom looked offended. Vera, you're part of this family. It was amazing how they could say that with straight faces. I was part of the family when it was convenient, when they needed someone to sacrifice for Melissa. Otherwise, I barely existed. I know, Mom, but this is an amazing opportunity. You're always saying how important it is to make something of yourself. This is me doing that. Melissa, who'd been quiet during this exchange, finally spoke. MIT is very prestigious. What are you studying? Computer science and economics, I said. I want to work in tech and finance. That's very practical, she said, and I could hear the disdain in her voice. Practical meant boring, meant not artistic, meant lesser than her creative pursuits. Someone has to be, I said lightly. They helped me move out, though helped was generous. Dad drove me to Boston. We barely spoke during the 8-hour drive. When we arrived at my dorm, he handed me $500 and said, for expenses, make it last. $500 for an entire semester. Meanwhile, Melissa's gallery had cost them over $30,000 once you counted the $8,000 from my possessions, the building improvements, the marketing, all of it. Thanks, Dad, I said, taking the money. He left within an hour. No tour of campus, no dinner, no fatherly advice about college life. Just a handshake and a make us proud. I watched his car disappear and felt nothing. No sadness, no anger. Just a clean, clear sense of finality. This was the last time they'd have any power over me. The last time their neglect could hurt me. I was free. The next 3 months at MIT were transformative. I threw myself into my studies, using my adult experience to excel far beyond my classmates. Professors noticed. I was invited to join research projects usually reserved for graduate students. I networked aggressively, building connections with people who would matter. But I also watched from a distance as my plan unfolded. In October, the first complaint came. A collector who'd bought one of my rare comic books had tried to have it authenticated for insurance. The expert had immediately identified it as a sophisticated forgery. The collector demanded his money back from the estate sale company. They investigated and traced the item back to Melissa. She called me, panicked. Vera, there's a problem. Someone's saying the comics I sold were fake. Fake? I asked, injecting just the right amount of confusion into my voice. How is that possible? Those were Grandpa's comics. I don't know, but they're saying they're forgeries. Really good ones, but fake. Did you know anything about this? No. Grandpa would never have fake comics. He was a collector. Are they sure? The expert seemed sure. Vera, what if all of it was fake? What if everything we sold was counterfeit? That can't be possible, I said. Where would Grandpa have gotten forgeries? He bought everything himself. Over the next 2 weeks, more complaints rolled in. The watches, fake. The vintage cameras, replicas. The paintings, copies. The jewelry, costume, despite being sold as authentic vintage. Every single item was revealed to be a forgery, and every single item traced back to Melissa's estate sale. The estate sale company threatened to sue her for fraud. The buyers were furious. The local art community started whispering. Had Melissa known? Was she a con artist? Or was she just incompetent? Her gallery's reputation was destroyed before it could build one. Artists pulled their work. The few collectors who'd shown interest disappeared. Local press, which had been gently positive, turned critical. How does a gallery owner not know fake from real? One article asked. The Melissa Reynolds forgery scandal raises serious questions about expertise in the local art scene. By November, Melissa was desperately calling me multiple times a day. Vera, I need your help. I need you to talk to these people. Explain that I didn't know the items were fake, that they were Grandpa's collection. I've told them that, I said. But Melissa, I'm at MIT. I can't come home for this. I have midterms. This is destroying me, she cried. My gallery is failing. People think I'm either a criminal or an idiot. I need you to help fix this. How can I fix it? I didn't sell the items. You did. But they were your things. You're right, I said quietly. They were my things. That you took. That you sold. I told you then that I didn't think it was a good idea, but you insisted they were just junk. You said I could have them. You said you wanted to support my gallery. I did say that, because you're my sister and I wanted to help you. But Melissa, I didn't authenticate them. I didn't sell them. I didn't make promises about what they were. You did all that. Vera, I have to go. I have a study group. Good luck with the gallery. I hung up and felt a cold satisfaction. This was only the beginning. My parents called next, together on speakerphone, a united front against the problem child. Vera, we need to talk about this situation with Melissa, Dad started. What situation? I asked innocently. Don't play dumb, the forgeries, the scandal. You know what we're talking about. I know that Melissa sold some items and they turned out to be fake. I don't know what that has to do with me. They were your items. Mom's voice was shrill. Your grandfather's collection that he left you. You must have known they were fake. Why would I know that? Grandpa collected those things. I trusted they were real. Did you think they were fake when you took them from my room? A pause. They didn't have an answer for that. The point is, Dad said, trying to regain control, Melissa is in serious trouble. The estate sale company is demanding $50,000 to cover refunds and legal fees. She could be sued by individual buyers. This could ruin her life. That's terrible, I said. What are you going to do? Vera, we need your help. You need to take responsibility for this. Responsibility for what? Grandpa's collection being fake? I didn't forge anything. I was 17 years old, grieving my grandfather, and I trusted that the things he left me were real. But you gave them to Melissa, Mom practically shouted. No, I corrected coldly. You took them from my room to fund Melissa's gallery. I didn't give you permission. I didn't volunteer them. You decided they were just junk, and that Melissa's dreams were more important than my possessions. Remember? I sat there and watched you box everything up. You said it was fine. You said you wanted to support her. What was I supposed to say? I was 17, you were my parents, and you'd already decided. Was I supposed to fight you? Would that have made any difference? Silence. The point is, I continued, my voice hard, you took my things without really asking. You sold them without checking what they were. You made assumptions about their value and authenticity. Those were your choices. I was a kid who trusted my grandfather. You were the adults. This isn't my fault. Vera, please. Dad's voice had shifted to pleading. Melissa is your sister. She needs help. We need to present a united front on this. We need to tell these people that the forgeries weren't intentional, that it was an honest mistake. It was an honest mistake, I said. On your part, you took items from a 17-year-old's room and sold them without proper authentication. That's on you. We can't afford $50,000, Mom cried. The gallery already cost us everything. We have nothing left. I felt that cold satisfaction again. They'd spent my college fund, taken my possessions, invested everything in Melissa's dream. And now it was all crumbling. I'm sorry to hear that, I said. Maybe you should have been more careful before making major financial decisions. That's what you always told me, right? To be practical, to think before acting. Vera, I have to go. I have class. I hung up and turned off my phone. They'd call again, I knew. This was far from over. But I was done being their solution to problems they'd created. December brought the real devastation. The estate sale company won a judgment against Melissa for $73,000, covering refunds, legal fees, and damages. She didn't have it. She'd already spent the gallery's operating capital trying to recover from the scandal. The gallery itself was bleeding money with no customers and no artists willing to show. She had to declare bankruptcy. At 22 years old, Melissa Reynolds was financially ruined, her reputation destroyed, her dreams dead. My parents tried to help, but they'd already extended themselves to the limit for her. They took out a second mortgage to pay part of the judgment, putting themselves in serious financial jeopardy. Dad's business was struggling. In my first life, this was right before he made a series of bad decisions that cost him everything. With their finances already strained, those decisions would hit even harder. And through it all, they kept calling me, begging me to help, to take responsibility, to fix the situation I'd created. I ignored most of the calls. When I did answer, I was polite but firm. This wasn't my problem. I was a teenager when Grandpa died. I had trusted his collection was authentic. I had been a victim of my family's decisions, not a perpetrator. "You're punishing us," Mom sobbed during one call. "You're punishing Melissa because you're jealous." "I'm not punishing anyone," I said calmly. "I'm at college, getting my education, building my future. That's not punishment. That's just me living my life." "You knew," she insisted. "You had to have known those items were fake. You let us sell them to destroy your sister." "If I knew they were fake, why would I have kept them?" I asked reasonably. "Why would I have treasured them for years?" "Mom, the simplest explanation is the truth. Grandpa's collection wasn't what anyone thought it was, and you sold it without checking. That's not my fault." But she couldn't accept that. None of them could, because accepting that meant admitting they'd made a massive mistake, that they'd taken my things without permission, sold them without proper authentication, and destroyed their golden child's future through their own negligence. It was easier to blame me. By Christmas, I didn't go home. I told them I had research obligations at MIT, that I couldn't get away. The truth was, I never wanted to see them again. Melissa sent me an email, a long, rambling message that veered between rage and pleading. "You did this on purpose," she wrote. "You knew those things were fake, and you let me sell them to ruin me. You've always been jealous of me, always wanted to tear me down. Well, congratulations. You won. You destroyed my gallery, my reputation, my life. I hope you're happy. I hope your revenge was worth it." I read the email once and deleted it. She still didn't understand. She thought this was about revenge, about jealousy, about hurting her. She had no idea what she'd actually lost. The spring semester of my freshman year, something remarkable happened in the art world. An artist named Chen Wei, whose early work I'd bought at flea markets for $5,100 apiece, had an absolute breakthrough. His paintings started selling for $200,000 each. Major museums acquired his work. He was hailed as the voice of a generation. I owned 7 of his early paintings, the real ones, safely stored, authenticated, and insured. They were worth approximately $1.4 million collectively. The news made waves in the collecting community. People started looking for Chen Wei's early work, trying to find hidden gems. And someone, somewhere, discovered that an estate sale in Massachusetts had sold 3 Chen Wei originals the previous summer, the same sale where the forgery scandal had broken. An art blogger decided to investigate. What happened to those paintings? Were they real or fake like everything else from that sale? The paintings, of course, had been the fakes I'd commissioned. The buyers had already returned them as forgeries during the original scandal. But now people wanted to know, had there really been authentic Chen Wei paintings in that collection? And if so, where were they now? The story went viral in art collecting circles. Estate sale may have contained millions in Chen Wei art, now lost to forgery scandal. That's when people started doing math. The watches that had been sold as fakes, if they'd been real, they'd have been worth about $800,000 based on recent auction prices for similar models. The comics, if authentic, nearly $4 million. The vintage cameras, $200,000. The jewelry, $600,000. If my collection had been real, it would have been worth approximately $7, $8 million. The art world was fascinated by the tragedy of it. The collection that could have been, the Melissa Reynolds mystery, read one headline. Some people thought the whole thing was a hoax, that the collection had never been real. Others thought maybe some pieces had been authentic and others fake, creating a confusing mess. A few conspiracy theorists suggested that someone had swapped the real collection for fakes, but that seemed unlikely. Who would do that and why? No one suspected the teenage sister who'd watched silently as her family looted her room. Melissa saw the articles. She called me, her voice hollow. "Vera, did you see? They're saying if your collection had been real, it would have been worth millions." "I saw," I said. "Was it real?" she asked. "Did Grandpa really give you millions of dollars in art and collectibles?" "I don't know," I said. "Apparently they were fake, so I guess not." "But what if they were real? What if Grandpa really did leave you something valuable and we—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Then I guess you sold millions of dollars worth of art and collectibles for $8,000, I said. "But they were fake, so it doesn't matter." "Vera, I have to go, Melissa. I have finals." I hung up and felt something close to pity. She was starting to understand, starting to grasp that maybe, possibly, she'd destroyed something irreplaceable. But she still couldn't quite believe it, couldn't quite accept it. She still didn't know the truth. Summer came, and with it, my return to Boston for a summer research position. I didn't go home, I didn't call, I was done with all of them. My investments had continued to grow, Bitcoin had exploded. My tech stocks had multiplied. I was worth over $5 million now, at 18 years old. And I had assets, real, authenticated, valuable assets, that were appreciating every day. I'd built everything my first life had lacked: security, freedom, success, and I'd done it without their help, despite their harm, in defiance of their neglect. But the real satisfaction came in August, exactly 1 year after I'd left for MIT. A Sotheby's auction featured an authenticated collection of Chen Wei's early work, 7 paintings, all from his crucial developmental period. The same 7 paintings I'd bought at flea markets that Melissa had thought she was selling but had actually sold fakes of. The collection sold for $2.1 million. My name was in the catalog as the consignor. Vera Reynolds, age 18, Boston, Massachusetts. The art world was stunned. The mysterious collection that had been lost to forgery hadn't been lost at all. The teenage sister had had the real paintings all along. Within hours, speculation exploded. Had I known? Had I swapped the real paintings for fakes? Had I deliberately deceived my family? Reporters called. I declined all interviews. But I did release one statement through Sotheby's. These paintings were gifts from my late grandfather and personal purchases I made over several years. They were authenticated by experts before I left for college and have been in secure storage since. I'm grateful for my grandfather's guidance in recognizing value and teaching me to protect what matters. That was it. No accusations, no blame. Just facts. But those facts told a story anyone could interpret. A teenage girl had owned valuable art. She'd had it authenticated and removed to secure storage before her family could take it. And then she'd watched as they sold what they thought was her entire collection, never knowing they were selling forgeries. The media ran with it. Teen outsmarts family and $2 million art heist, legally. How one girl protected her inheritance from her own parents. The youngest art collector who knew what her family didn't. My family saw the articles, they saw my name, they saw the $2.1 million sale price, and finally they understood. The phone calls came fast and furious. Mom, Dad, Melissa, all of them screaming, crying, demanding answers. I answered one call, just one, with all 3 of them on the line. "You knew," Dad said, his voice shaking with rage. "You knew the whole time. You switched the real collection for fakes and let us sell them." "I protected my inheritance," I corrected. "I had Grandpa's collection authenticated after he died, realized what it was worth, and secured it properly. That's called being responsible." "You let us humiliate ourselves. You let Melissa get sued. You destroyed us," Mom shrieked. "No," I said calmly. "You destroyed yourselves. I sat on my bed and watched you take my things without real permission. I watched you decide my possessions were worthless. I watched you prioritize Melissa's dreams over my property rights. You made every choice that led to this. You could have told us they were valuable." Melissa's voice was broken, destroyed. "You could have stopped us. The same way you could have asked properly before taking them? The same way you could have had them authenticated before selling them? The same way you could have treated me like I mattered? That kind of could have. We're your family." "You treated me like a resource to be mined for Melissa's benefit," I said. "You spent my college fund on her gallery?" You took my possessions for her dream. You never once considered that I might matter as much as her, so I protected myself. That's not wrong. That's survival. Vera, please. Dad tried. Let's talk about this. There's still the watches, the comics, the cameras. All real, I confirmed. All authenticated. All safely stored and appreciating in value. The watches alone are worth about $1.2 million now. The comics, close to $5 million. The cameras, around $300,000. The jewelry, $750,000. Total collection value, approximately $9.5 million. The silence on the other end was absolute. You see, I continued, Grandpa was a collector, a real one. He knew value, he taught me to recognize it. And he left me something extraordinary, not just objects, but knowledge, the ability to see what others miss. You owe us, Dad started. I owe you nothing, I interrupted. Less than nothing. You gave me $500 for college. That's the sum total of your financial contribution to my life. Meanwhile, you spent over $50,000 on Melissa's failed gallery. You took my possessions worth millions and sold them for $8,000 without checking what they were. You made your choices. These are the consequences. We'll sue you, Mom threatened. Those things were community property. They should have been split. Grandpa's will was very specific. Everything was left to me directly. I was a minor, yes, but the items were legally mine. I had every right to protect them, and your attempt to take them without proper consent could actually be considered theft. Would you like me to pursue that angle? They wouldn't, and they knew it. Please, Melissa whispered, please, Vera. I lost everything, the gallery, my reputation, my future. And now I find out it was all for nothing because the real collection was worth millions? Please, I'm your sister. You were never my sister, I said quietly. You were competition I didn't know I was in. You were a golden child who needed a black sheep. You were a star who needed someone dimmed so you could shine brighter. But you were never my sister. Vera, goodbye, I said. Don't call again. Don't come to Boston. Don't contact me. We're done. I hung up and blocked all their numbers. It was over. The aftermath was predictable but satisfying. My parents lost their house to foreclosure. The combination of Melissa's judgment debt, the failed gallery investment, and Dad's business collapse was too much to overcome. They moved into a small apartment, their comfortable middle-class life destroyed. Melissa declared bankruptcy, as I knew she would. Her art career was dead before it started. She ended up working retail. Her dreams of gallery ownership and artistic recognition replaced with the reality of minimum wage and creditors. Dad's business failed completely. The same bad decisions I'd watched him make in my first life hit even harder this time, with no financial cushion to absorb the impact. He ended up working as a middle manager for someone else, all his entrepreneurial dreams gone. Mom fell into depression, unable to reconcile the daughter she'd ignored with the millionaire I'd become. She'd spent my entire childhood telling me I was lesser, ordinary, forgettable. And I'd become extraordinary while her precious Melissa crumbled. They tried to reconcile, tried to repair the relationship. Letters, emails, attempts to show up at MIT. I ignored all of it. They'd had 17 years to love me, see me, value me. They'd chosen not to. I didn't owe them a second chance. The media loved my story. Self-made teen millionaire became a narrative of empowerment. I gave a few carefully selected interviews, always framing it the same way. I'd been lucky to have a grandfather who taught me to recognize value. I'd been smart enough to protect my inheritance, and I'd built on that foundation through education and strategic investing. I never directly accused my family of abuse or theft. I didn't have to. The facts spoke for themselves. They'd taken a teenager's possessions, sold them without proper authentication, and destroyed their lives in the process, while I'd quietly protected what mattered and built a fortune. By my sophomore year at MIT, I was worth over $12 million. The art collection continued to appreciate. My investments kept multiplying. I'd started a consulting firm helping young people protect and grow inherited assets. I bought a beautiful apartment in Boston. I traveled. I made friends who valued me. I dated people who saw me. I built a life that was entirely, completely, triumphantly mine. And sometimes, late at night, I thought about my first life. about dying alone in that apartment, about what would have happened if I'd never been given a second chance. I'd been shown exactly what I'd lost in that life. $9.5 million in assets, opportunities beyond measure, security I'd never known. I'd lost it because I hadn't protected it, hadn't valued myself enough to fight back, hadn't understood until too late that my family was the threat. But this time, I'd known. This time, I'd planned. This time, I'd let them take what they thought they wanted while protecting what really mattered. They'd sold my things for her, for Melissa, for their golden child, for their favorite. They'd thought they were saving her dreams and disposing of my junk. They never knew what they lost. Not until it was far, far too late. And by then, I was already gone, already free, already winning a game they hadn't known we were playing. That's what made it perfect. Not that I'd beaten them, though I had. Not that I'd taken revenge, though in a way I had. But that I'd simply valued myself more than they ever had, and that had been enough. I was enough. I'd always been enough. It had just taken dying and being reborn to learn that lesson. But I'd learned it, and I'd never forget it again. 5 years after that bedroom confrontation, after they'd boxed up what they thought was my entire collection, I attended a gala at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. I was 22, a recent MIT graduate, and one of the museum's youngest major donors. I wore a vintage Cartier necklace, one of the pieces Mom had thought was costume jewelry. It was worth $150,000, and it looked stunning with my custom gown. The event was celebrating a new contemporary art wing, partially funded by my donation. My name was on a wall, Vera Reynolds, benefactor. Midway through the evening, I overheard a conversation between two older collectors. Did you hear about that Chen Wei collection that sold a few years back? The one with the whole forgery scandal? Oh yes, the Reynolds situation. Quite the story. I heard the family is completely destitute now, lost everything. The daughter who had the real collection won't speak to them. Can you blame her? They tried to steal millions from their own child. Some people just don't recognize value until it's gone. I smiled, sipped my champagne, and moved on. They had no idea I was that daughter, that Reynolds. I'd changed my hair, my style, my entire presence. I was unrecognizable from the quiet, overlooked teenager I'd been, and that was the real victory. Not that they'd fallen, though they had. Not that I'd risen, though I had. But that I'd become someone entirely new. Someone they couldn't touch, couldn't diminish, couldn't erase. They'd tried to sell me piece by piece to liquidate my worth for Melissa's benefit. They'd thought I was nothing but raw materials for her success. They never knew that every piece they sold was worthless, that the real treasure had already been secured, protected, hidden away from their grasping hands. They never knew what they lost because they'd never really known what they had. They'd had a daughter who could see value where others saw junk, who could build empires from nothing, who could survive, thrive, and ultimately triumph despite their worst efforts. They'd had me, and they'd thrown me away like garbage, so I'd let them. I'd let them sell everything, think they'd won, believe they'd finally put me in my place beneath Melissa's shadow. And then I'd stepped into the light they never knew I could reach, wearing a crown they never knew existed, ruling a kingdom they never knew was mine. The last time I saw any of them was by accident, 3 years after the gala. I was in my hometown for a business meeting, walking through the mall, when I spotted Mom. She was older, grayer, tired. She was looking at a window display of jewelry, her face wistful. She looked up, and our eyes met. For a moment, neither of us moved, then she took a step toward me. I turned and walked away. I heard her call my name, but I didn't stop. I didn't owe her anything. Not acknowledgement, not forgiveness, not even hatred. I was free. Completely, totally, triumphantly free. And that freedom was worth more than all the millions in the world. And they'd tried to sell my things for her. They'd tried to liquidate my life for Melissa's dreams. But they never knew what they had. They never knew what they lost. And by the time they finally understood, I was already gone. Transformed, transcendent, and utterly beyond their reach. That was my revenge. Not destruction, though they were destroyed. Not cruelty, though justice was served. Just living well, living free, living as the person I'd always deserved to be, and the person they'd never seen, the person I'd become anyway, despite them all.